All right, so we've just talked about critical methodologies, or one critical methodology in the composition of the Pentateuch. But the scholars are using not just that one, they're using others as well. And so we've got to talk about the big picture, because when you read a commentary, you're going to have to evaluate, what is this person's approach? Do I really want to listen to this person? Do I want to read them? And as you read them, you'll see how they're approaching the Old Testament, whether they've got a high view of Scripture or a low view. And you can see at times how they're presenting the text and what methods they're using to approach the text, to study the text, to interpret it. So these critical methodologies, some of them are okay. I talked about text criticism. That's good. It's not one that you'd want to use this as a devotional, that's for sure. But it helps us figure out the text, and that's part of critical scholarship and part of good critical commentary. So that's useful. But there are others, like the source criticism, that's not helpful. So let's talk a little bit about these critical methodologies. And these are not in historical order as far as when they came about, but they are in the order of how scholars are thinking of them as far as them coming about. They would say first, there's form criticism, and that is the idea that there is an oral form, that first these stories in the Bible were talked about. Tribes were talking about it, and they were, ancient peoples were given these stories about Noah and the flood. That's why there's flood stories everywhere. And so form criticism tries to go back to the oral form of the original and its setting as well for its oral tradition of where it comes from. And so form criticism is concerned with the setting and life. So Sitzenleben is the German term for it. Often speculating about what the setting and life might be. And so depending on where they set it in, that's the context. And it's very subjective, because it's oral form and we don't have a record. They're just conjecturing what the oral form was behind the text and what the setting in life might be. Now, form criticism has a part of it is looking at literary structure. So a lament psalm has a literary structure to it, a descriptive praise psalm, a declarative praise psalm. These have specific structures. Sometimes there's structures to prophetic judgment speeches. It's common to do a prophetic judgment speech in a certain way. Just like you have a business document, business letter, a love letter, sonnets written certain ways. That part of form criticism is good. The other stuff, setting in life and all that stuff, is just not useful. But that's the first one as far as how they would view the text as developed. The next would be tradition criticism. And that gets between the oral form and the redacted source. A redaction is when you take sources and you sew them together, you edit them together. Tradition criticism is, okay, where were these stories were a northern tradition in the nation of Israel. The oral stories were northern, or they were southern, or they come from the east, or they come from Egypt, and that sort of thing. So they're looking at where these different traditions collected. Again, not really very helpful. Then there's source criticism. Well, we've already talked about source criticism. It's a written source, so the traditions are written down. You have written sources, and tries to get back to those original sources. It fragments the text into multiple pieces, various authors, and all that sort of thing. Then there's a criticism that focuses on how those sources were sewn together, redaction criticism, and edited together. It assumes the text that we have as a result of various other texts that have been filtered through an editor or more than one editor, and attempts to determine why the redactor arranged the text in a particular order. So why is it in a particular order? Now, I'm interested in orders of text, because they're not always in chronological order, and I'm interested in how the author's shaping the text by the order if he says things. But that's different from what redactors are doing, because they're taking it that they're varied and little fragmented things, that they're not taking one author, they're taking multiple authors and piecing things together, and that the redactor has an agenda of his own, not the same agenda as the author of the different texts. I would looking for one author, intentional, that sort of thing. unless we're talking about the Book of Kings, which we know has 400 years and multiple authors, and then it's edited together. That one, I could see the redaction issue. The problem with redaction, critics often create their own supposed sources. They don't ever divide the text the same. And we see that with source criticism as well. Its usefulness depends on the reliability of the sources and the credibility of the redactor. So you could do some redacting with modern documents, but very difficult with ancient and not really helpful so much with the Bible. Evangelicals don't do it much. Those who do this, it's an academic exercise because they don't really believe in the meaning of the text anyway, what it says. They don't really care, I guess. But in any case. Then there's historical criticism. Historical criticism takes these sources, as they're redacted together, maybe oral form, whatever, and they're looking for what's the kernel of truth in here. Okay, there's David and Goliath. Okay, maybe there was some kid and he fought a big guy, but that doesn't. They'll say maybe there's a truth to that, but there's not a truth to anything else. It's all made up. That's what they're looking. The historical says, what can I prove extra biblically? And so, if I can prove that maybe there was at David, then I might say something about him. It doesn't mean that they would hold to David as a king or Israel as a state, that sort of thing. But they're looking for that kernel of truth. Narratives, they say, are theological and not historical, so they don't deal with them too much. The problem is they often deny supernatural in history like the others. They're denying the supernatural. They restructure what happened at the crossing of the Red Sea into the crossing of a swamp, which it doesn't matter whether it's 80 fathoms deep or it's 3 feet deep or 10 feet deep, excuse me. I wouldn't say 3 feet, but 10 feet deep, because the Egyptians would drown either way. Scripture doesn't tell us that, but they would make it into a very small swamp, and they're crossing over on wet, swampy ground. Anyway. They're trying to explain miracles away and things like that. So historical criticism, like some of these others, is highly subjective and requires reading into the text what they want it to say. Well, you've got a text at this point in criticism, and textual criticism is a good criticism. We talked about that one already. It takes multiple manuscripts and copies and says, okay, which one is it Jesus went down the road? Is it Jesus and James and John went down the road? Or is it Jesus and the disciples that went down the road? Which is the best family of text? It means Jesus went down the road, but someone's going with him. And which of those is correct? And so it weighs that and says, oh, it really should be Jesus, James, and John went down the road. And that's what you'll see translated most often in this one verse in the Scriptures. But the others are possible variants. And that's what text criticism does. It evaluates copies and variations and says, we think this one's the best one. So it's also called lower criticism. It asks the question, what were the original words in the text? So it's basic text work. It's useful. It's a useful method. Problem with Old Testament text, there's not a lot of texts. There are texts, but there's not as many. There's thousands of New Testament documents. Then there's rhetorical criticism. This assumes a unified text. That means that the Bible and its books are unified works. And it looks at the text like it's communicated. I love that. That's what we want, right? We want to study the books of the Bible in whole as communicated, as written by one author. The structure of the text helps communicate. That's what they hold to. It looks at the structure, how it's put together, considers all these things, looks at the intended meaning. The only thing is, they don't believe it's historical. They think that it was written much, much later, and so, or edited together. They don't care whether it was how it came to being. They just say that it had its final editor, has a meaning. So that's the only problem with it. While they hold to the unity of the text, they throw out history. Structural analysis is another critical methodology that's used, and it looks at the text like literary art. It looks at how the text was put together to get its message across, which is fine. Those are good things from our perspective. The problem is that it fictionalizes Scripture. It says it's fiction. It's just great literature, and that's a problem. And then there's the canonical approach. Well, it takes the final form of the text. Again, it takes the final form, as developed by the source criticisms and deals with it from that point through time. So in other words, okay, once you have the whole thing, how does each generation treat it? And what is canon? So the canon changes according to canon criticism, and how we treat it and how we interpret it. So they would say it's normal that the Catholic Church added the Apocrypha, those books between the Old and New Testament, and that's the new canon to them. That's canon criticism. So there are some things about it that I can see, the shaping of putting them all together. I can see, but what time period is the right canon? Is it Jesus' day? Well, what about the Old Testament as a whole before Jesus' day? Because it might be structured differently. It becomes difficult. The danger is they look at the canon and how it has been interpreted in their own way and interpret how it's been interpreted in each generation. And each generation can look at the text in their own way and interpret it differently, and that's fine with them. So that's a problem. There are other ideological criticisms like liberation theology and feminist studies and racial or regional studies, Asian studies, whatever. And they're looking at how do we interpret it for us rather than what did it mean to the original author and his audience. And that's where we really need to be. So some of these other critical methodologies are fine. Many of them are not helpful at all. So you need to be careful as you read and realize these things are taking place. Everybody's got an agenda. They're not always going to tell you their methodology. Those who do are honest. Most think most think that this reader response idea or interpretation and not inspiration, but interpretation belongs to the reader, and that they believe that they are the ideal reader, and that's a problem. So you'll have scholars that write wonderfully, and yet when it comes to asking them about the text, they disagree with other people because they think they're the best reader of it. We all tend to do that, right? We think I've got the right view, but that can be a problem when they're departing from the text. I've seen modern scholars who are well-written, well-read, and famous authors making a lot of money, well-published, but they communicate well, but they depart from the text. That's a problem. So read the text. Stick to what it says. You're not going to be wrong. All right. The next, coming up, archaeology and history.